Welcome to GS Podcast number 103. How is everybody? Good? Good. I'm very pleased to have Andrew Copson return to the show. More on that in a moment. I've realised I'm pretty appalling at self-promotion, and I don't really often explain what Patreon is, but I shall do this now. Fret not, I will be very quick. Everything I produce, from podcast to videos on YouTube, coverage from events, to articles on my blog, is entirely independent. It's a one-man operation. It's also entirely listener-supported. This means that I don't have to toe to any publication's house rules or pander to advertisers with my content. It's all what I think is valuable to focus on. So if you think some of that's valuable too and would like to support those efforts, you can do so by visiting patreon.com/gspellchecker. This just allows you to contribute however much you want. You can set this as a contribution per item, or you can set it as a contribution per month. You're entirely in control, and you can cancel at any point you choose. But why would you? Of course. Your support is greatly appreciated, and I'll be saying a personal thanks to a number of contributors at the end of this podcast. Like I said, very pleased to have Andrew Copson return to the podcast. Andrew's the Chief Executive of Humanists UK, formerly known as the British Humanist Association. Just an all-round lovely guy. I always look forward to him popping up on Sunday morning religious debate. Always leads with compassion. I shared a panel with him in probably about 2014 now, on free speech in Manchester. It was my first panel, and he was very friendly and jokey with me beforehand, which just helped settle my nerves a little bit, which is greatly appreciated. But whenever I've bumped into him since at various events, he's always been very warm and friendly, and always makes time to speak to people. And he's got this fantastic book out at the moment called Secularism, Politics, Religion and Freedom. Now, whenever I interview somebody on my show about a book, I always make sure that I read it from cover to cover, because I can't with any good conscience recommend a book to people that I haven't read. But I'm perfectly happy in saying this is definitely something you should pick up, rather than it being just a sort of a firebrand polemic in favour of secularism. It's a very objective overview, and I took a lot away from it. It covers secularism from a historical point, its early beginnings. It talks about how secularism is applied or not applied in various different countries and cultures, and what the ramifications of that are. And it also includes a number of arguments in favour of secularism, and to balance that out, a number of arguments against secularism. So it's really, really interesting to grapple with some of those objections, really. It's part of the a short introductions series, but it packs a lot of information in such a slim volume, so I shall put a link to that in the show notes of this episode. Like I said, Andrew's the Chief Executive of Humanists UK, and I'm a member. I always think if you're really passionate about secularism and freedom from religion and freedom to religion, and trying to engender a more humanist approach, these are the guys who do the groundwork. These are the guys who campaign, who put pressure on our governments, who keep their eyes on what's happening in schools, whether or not children are being forced to adhere to very conservative religious norms in state schools, etc. And these are the people that raise the alarm and challenge these things and make change happen, essentially. So if you feel passionate about these things, then I would really recommend chipping in, becoming a member. You can do this by visiting humanist.uk. If you can't become a member right now, have a look at some of their campaigns. Consider spreading them around on social media, or bringing them to the attention of your local MPs. Everything you can do to support really does help. You can find Andrew on Twitter at Andrew Copson. Send him some love, send him some kind words. I'm sure he'd be happy to hear from you. And you can keep up to date on this fine podcast and everything else I'm up to at gspellchecker.com. Enjoy! It's a great pleasure to welcome Andrew Copson back to the GS podcast. Hello, sir.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you doing?
Yes, fantastic. It was good to see you a couple of weeks back for the Holyoake lecture. Really successful event. packed out. Good response to the talk from Douglas Murray. Owen Jones was the guest speaker previous to that, the previous Holyoake lecture, and I think there's quite a distance between the politics of Douglas Murray and Owen Jones, to put it lightly. And I remember saying to you afterwards, I'm very pleased that you think it's worthwhile speaking to people on different ends of the political spectrum, and I don't see enough of that, unfortunately. Maybe you could speak a little bit about why you think that's important.
Yeah, I'm happy to that. I mean, I agree with you. I think that one of the great difficulties in our politics today, UK, the wider West, and in fact the world, is the polarization that's occurring, and also the assumption of bad faith that often occurs between people who disagree politically. I think it's really important, especially in a democracy, that if we disagree with each other, we can do so in a rational and courteous way, because I think it's a big deterrent to participation by ordinary citizens if they see this ferocious, polarized political world in front of them. It's something they don't want to get involved in. So I think it's very important, if we want to have engaged people involved in politics, but also make progress, which is obviously a humanist view of politics, that we can make progress in this world, and that we have that breadth of opinion in the humanist movement, but also model a way of disagreeing politely. I think that, Owen Jones gave the Holyoake lecture last year, as you say. Douglas Murray gave it this year, but we gave them both the same title. So the title of both their lectures was Towards a Humanist Politics. And we were particularly interested in seeing where they might overlap, because, as you say, they come from very different points on the political spectrum in all sorts of ways. But I think what was interesting is what did unite them in what they said about humanist politics. They both talked about democracy. They both talked about participation. They both talked about the rule of law. They both talked about a certain liberality of attitude. And democracy, human rights, the rule of law, these things are not present all around the world. And so although Douglas and Owen might have a great deal they disagree about, in fact, in a global context, they've got a lot more in common.
They should go for a pint, is what you're essentially saying.
Yeah, or two.
Just a quick point. I've noticed that formerly the British Humanist Association, now Humanists UK. Just wondering, maybe you could speak to the reason behind the rebranding.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we started off in the late 19th century as the Union of Ethical Societies.
It's a mouthful.
Yes, exactly. And a more 19th century name could hardly be imagined. In the wildest of speculative or steampunk fiction, you wouldn't get such a league title as that. And then we changed to the Ethical Union in the 20s, and in the 60s to the British Humanist Association, and now just recently, as you say, Humanists UK. I think that, well, if humanists believe anything about society and politics, they believe in changing with the times, not for its own sake, but to keep up with all that's best and new in contemporary thinking. And I think the updating of our name and our brand, you could say, we're not obviously a commercial organisation, but I think brand thinking is everywhere now. That sort of updating of our image, let's put it that way, or as we said in the announcement, the evolution of our image was for a number of reasons. So British Humanist Association, we're evidence-led. So, of course, before we did anything, we tested what the population at large thinks of that name. So we had focus groups of non-religious people across the country, non-religious people who had never heard of us before, as well as questionnaires to our existing members. And one of the things that the focus groups of people, non-religious people who'd never heard of us before, reacted to in the name British Humanist Association was, first of all, the British. They felt it was a sort of limiting word in a way that they didn't think that UK was. They felt that British was a sort of ethnically limiting word. And when you've got an idea like the humanist approach, which is all about, human beings and a global perspective and seeing, humanity as one species in very important ways, the British sort of jarred in a way that the UK, which is just a description of an actual, political area of land, didn't. So the British were seen as too limiting, so that went. And the word association, people just didn't respond to as a concept that seemed welcoming to them. I mean, I think it's quite an old-fashioned word now, and a lot of people in the focus groups felt, responded to, so I don't know what it means. Is it some sort of, trade union? And I think that's is an old-fashioned sort of word to describe a collection of people. And of course, we're not a private members club in Humanists UK. We're not there for our members. We're there for public benefit and for society, and to achieve our campaigning aims, provide our community services, and spread understanding of humanism to the population generally. So I think it was quite a closed-off concept. So humanists, we were left with the word humanists as the one word out of British Humanist Association that people did respond to. And so we slapped a UK on the end to show where the area we operate, and decided we would just be Humanists UK, because that's who we are and what we do. And so it was the product of a rigorous evidence-led process over the course of a year, as to were the design elements for the new sort of image of the organisation. But that's what we ended up with. And it's been incredibly successful, I think. People have definitely responded to it. And in fact, I realised that even when we were called British Humanist Association, people would routinely refer to us as the humanists. So it's almost bringing our image up into line with reality.
Yeah, I think it works. I think I prefer it, actually, on balance.
Oh, good.
One final question, actually, on the Holyoake lecture before we move on to your fantastic book. There's a lot of people committed to the idea of deplatforming at the moment, especially in regards to controversial speakers. And I know Owen Jones is fairly controversial, so is Douglas Murray. It's probably especially Douglas Murray. And I wondered if you either received any complaints in your choice of speaker and calls for deplatforming when arranging these events, and if so, which speaker received the most pushback?
Like a sort of clapometer, a deplatformometer.
Yeah.
Controversy, of course, is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, you say maybe
Sure.
Douglas Murray is more controversial. Maybe you move in left-leaning circles. I don't know. But Owen Jones, I think, was equally controversial when we announced him. But, often controversial speakers are the ones really worth listening to. In spite of what I said earlier about needing not to polarize society, I think that we all need to be challenged by ideas that are not our own. I mean, I think the only way that we make personal intellectual progress, the only way we develop our own ideas, is being exposed to and challenged by the ideas of others that are very different to our own. And that's not only true on an individual level, that's true on a social level. I think the only way that society can develop and the social development can be achieved and that civilization can advance to the extent that it can advance is by exposure to fresh ideas, new ideas, the coming together of ideas, their synthesis, their clash, and so on and so forth. So that's my view in general about those who try and silence or censor people. I think, let me be diplomatic and say I think we had equal numbers of complaints about both of them. But you're quite right that we received remonstrances from people who urged us not to have such speakers.
Right, sure.
And from right and left on each occasion.
It's strange, really, isn't it? Because if you have an issue with one of those individuals, either Owen or Douglas, it's the perfect opportunity to turn up for the Q&A section at the end. And
well, that's what I said to everyone who objected to either of them. I said, well, please come along.
Yeah.
With time for questions, and I'm sure they'll be happy to speak to you afterwards as well.
Yeah.
And these are events organised, by a private organisation after all. I mean, people are free to attend or not attend any, of our events. And I think that's, this whole notion of not giving people a platform, I think it's sometimes correct not to give people a platform.
Yeah.
I think it would be, big. Well, you can think of contexts where you don't want to give people a platform. For example, if you were to, invite someone with extreme anti-Semitic views to address the annual meeting of the British Board of Deputies of British Jews, that would not be an appropriate or sensible thing to do. And I can think of other situations where that might be, where you might draw the line. When I was at university, certainly we would never have invited speakers with, virulent racist or homophobic views into our university college, because the college was not just an academic institution, but people's home, the common room was where they needed to feel comfortable eating a sandwich, reading the paper, whatever. So events that were held there, we always would have been very rigorous about. But events that were held in university lecture halls, or student unions, or in the public spaces of the campus, of course, there would never have been any question of denying anyone a platform on account of their views, as long as they were interesting in context and something that people wanted to listen to. So I think that one of the problems in recent years is that the very appropriate notion of safe spaces, in private and in domestic areas, which obviously includes, for example, your own home. No one has a right to come and preach hate to you in your own living room, but can also include some, private spaces within places like university campuses. That notion of perfectly appropriate, safe and comfortable private spaces has spilled out as if, everywhere needs to be a safe space, even the very public areas of a university, or, the very public areas of our common life. And of course, that's not sustainable if you want real freedom of expression for people.
So I really want to talk about your book. It's called Secularism, Politics, Religion and Freedom, which I said to you just before we started recording that I really, really enjoyed. I think one of my biggest weak areas is history. I kind of regret not paying attention in school, and I feel like I'm constantly in a state of catch-up, so it was nice to get a very historical overlook. And it's part of the short introduction series, and I thought, maybe why did you choose that format? I mean, you could have wrote an entire book which was just advocating secularism and making the case for it. Instead, what we've got here is a very objective overview of all the different types of secularism, common arguments for, common arguments against, the history. What made you decide to go down that format route?
Well, that's a very good question. I said before we came on air how acute and intelligent your questions were, and I'll repeat it again. That is a very good question. The very short introduction series that is produced by Oxford University Press, one of the obligations that authors have in that series is, as you say, to be objective and to produce a short book, 35,000 words maximum, that will lay out in as disinterested and impartial a way as possible the basic bones and a bit of flesh on the bones as well of a particular subject. And this, although it's out in hardback now, is a book that will eventually, in about a year, go into that very short introductions paperback format. So this book had to satisfy those tests. And it was difficult writing, for example, the chapter on the case against secularism, which was something that obviously had to be included given the book needed to be impartial. But I think it was actually quite good for me. I mean, we were saying a moment ago about how important it is to expose yourself to different points of view. And I think that that's not only because your own view might change as a result, but also that entering into dialogue, if you want, with other points of view from your own can also help to refine and hone your own opinions. I did feel differently, actually, about secularism by the time I'd finished this book than I did at the beginning. I'm definitely still a secularist, and we might say perhaps
you didn't talk yourself out of it then.
I did not talk myself out of it, no. Maybe we could say at the beginning here that secularism, the secularism that the book is about, is the way the word is used mostly in the UK, i.e. sort of political secularism as it applies to politics and the ordering of states and so on. Because in the US, the word secularism is used a bit more generically to mean sort of just non-religiousness. But this book is about, specifically, as the subtitle says, politics and secularism in relation to politics. So I'm definitely still a secularist by the time I finished thinking about and then writing the book. But I think I'm probably a slightly more careful one. I think that I'll be a bit more pragmatic at the end of this book. No doubt we'll come on to the content of it. But I think it was... I think I chose to do it a balanced text, objective text, to go at your actual question, because I thought it would be good for me to think about and my own views on the question, to try and produce the fairest account of both sides of secularism that I could. And I think it was good for me. Maybe the next book will be more polemical, but this one was, although difficult to write, quite personally instructive to write as well.
Yeah, I mean, with you saying you think that's good for you, I think it may be good for the average secular activist as well. I mean, it's better than, I suppose, just reading something and fist bumping all the way along that it agrees with your already preconceived notions. I think reading some of the arguments in your book as well has helped strengthen some of my arguments for secularism and helped me drop a few bad ones along the way as well, which is always valuable.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, and I hope it will have that effect. I mean, I think that's good as well. I think you're right. There is no other single volume introduction to secularism in English in the world.
That's incredible, isn't it? That's a strange thing.
Exactly. It really is. There are many sort of multi-part, multi-contributor sort of volumes of chapters by different people about secularism, and there are some shorter sort of introductory text to secularism in the sense of general non-religiousness, but none of this type. So I think that I hope that you're right, that the book will prove instructive for people who are secularists as well as reaching a wide audience. Which arguments did you drop? Well, what arguments did it make you give up for secularism?
Well, it made me reconsider. I mean, you speak a little bit about the Christian influence on the emergence of secularism, and secularism to me has always been something that's been kind of a product of the Enlightenment. And which maybe you could talk a little bit about that in terms of how certain Christian thinkers built the starting blocks of what we have as secularism today.
Well, of course, you're right that secularism takes off in the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
It is, in its modern form, it is mostly a product of the European Enlightenment. But it's not exclusively a product of the European Enlightenment. First of all, it's important to say that in countries like India, there are long proto-secular arrangements in politics in India, long before the European Enlightenment. And India's secularism today is, informed by those native traditions of secularism as much as it is by the European Enlightenment that came to them via colonization. So there's global diversity in the origin of secularism. But you're right, there's also secularism before, the beginnings of secularism before the Enlightenment, even in Europe. And one of those sources of secularism is Christianity. It's difficult in Europe of the past, pre-Enlightenment Europe, it's difficult to pick apart what of European culture pre-Enlightenment is informed by Christianity and what is not. Many Christian historians today, especially the more polemical, sort of like to claim the whole of pre-Enlightenment Europe as a Christian product. Christian content. Of course, that's not true. It was never the case that everyone in Europe was a Christian. There were plenty of humanists, sometimes closet humanists, of course, when it was illegal not to be a Christian, and Jews and Arabs and people from other backgrounds and traditions, and pagans even across Europe well into Christian times. But in pre-Enlightenment Europe, the origins of secularism definitely have Christian contributors. And it comes down to the Christian idea that it's possible to separate conduct in this world and right and good behaviour in this world and the affairs of this world from the affairs of another world. The idea that God's realm might be something different from Caesar's, in that famous expression in the New Testament, rendering giving to
Caesar,
God what is God's, giving to Caesar what is Caesar's. Exactly, it implies a distinction between the civic political realm and the realm of God. Now, that distinction maybe isn't there at the beginning of that text or that story, but later Christians certainly in their theology have the ability to read in, to that story, that sort of separation, and rendering to Caesar what is Caesar's and God what is God's becomes a sort of proto-secularist point of view. And of course, this really takes off in the Reformation, and which was celebrating, I don't know, marking the the 400th anniversary of at the moment in Europe. And this takes off, of course, with Luther's thought, where he, in his theology, makes it clear that in his eyes, and in good Lutherans' eyes in the following centuries, therefore, there is a sort of righteousness, a sort of civic righteousness, a sort of civic good behaviour that non-Christians can have in this world, and that our shared life as citizens or as members of a common society can have different rules applying in it. than our life as Christian believers or as religious believers of any sort, or as whatever believers of whatever doctrine we might subscribe to. Now, I mean, this does not achieve full flowering in the Christian period of Europe. It needs the Enlightenment to give it the final elements. For example, the idea that consent for government comes from the people, and that's its authority, which is never something that really Christian thinkers before the Enlightenment would have thought. They thought that, the sanction for political power came down from God through monarchs or princes, or sometimes through oligarchs or whatever. But authority came from above. Ultimately, the Enlightenment introduced the idea that the authority of government depended on the consent of the governed, and that allows constitutional secularism to begin in places like America and in France as a sort of social contract. So although it never achieved full flowering in Christian Europe, the seeds of secularism are there.
Okay, and I pretty much think that's the most amount of praise Christianity will get for the rest of the podcast.
They did. Yeah, I mean, they did. The Christian Europe did a good job in laying the foundations for something better.
Very diplomatic.
And also in motivating the desire of people for something better.
Sure. One of the things that comes through very clearly in your book as well is that there are many different versions of secularism. Some people merely pay lip service to the idea. Some people just have different ideas and practices. And I was wondering, you touch upon the French, popularised French idea. Is it pronounced laïcité?
Laïcité, yeah.
Nailed it. That's often generally referred to as aggressive secularism. People often point to that as the example of where secularism leads. And do you feel that maybe France's approach to the idea of secularism might make it difficult for more moderate secularists to make their case?
Well, I think that the sort of criticisms that you're alluding to there are probably the sort of criticisms that we find largely made by English speakers and the English world against French secularism. And very often that comes from a very different American tradition of secularism. And it's one of the things that I discuss, at least in part in the book, the difference between US style secularism and French style secularism. Now, those differences are complicated, and they have to do with the religious history of the United States versus the religious history of France. They have to do with the nature of the world at the time when secularism was codified in their constitutions, and also, the couple of hundred years of development in both those countries since. Broadly speaking, the reason why lots of English speakers criticize French secularism is because secularism for an English speaker is largely, especially from the American tradition, a matter of religious freedom. So the reason that the United States has a secular state is that the founders of the United States and its early generations of politicians wanted to maximize religious freedom. They thought that freedom was a good thing in all areas of life, free expression, free press, and one of those freedoms is freedom of religion. And the reason that it's unconstitutional for Congress to ever establish a religion in the United States, or to interfere with the free exercise of religion in the United States, or to apply religious tests for public officers in the United States, all of which is in the US Constitution. The reason is not because the founders of the United States hated religion, although some of them didn't like it. It's because they wanted people to be free. And so US-style secularism is really there to protect religion from the state. French secularism has quite a different origin. It has some of that in it as well, especially in more recent times. But the origin of French secularism really comes about in reaction against a very controlling and totalitarian Catholic Church, which was hand in glove with a very totalitarian and centralizing monarchy. And so when the French Revolution comes along and people reject the unfair power structures that are crushing them, they reject the Catholic Church at the same time as they reject the crown. And French secularism, as a result, has a much more anti-religious, anti-clerical character compared especially with US-style secularism. So if secularism in America is there to protect religion from the state, then secularism in France is definitely there to protect the state and, by extension, its citizens from religion. And that gives it immediately a more anti-clerical, anti-religious flavour. Now, citizens of France, by the time we got to the 20th century, had largely come to live with that. You get some people like Sarkozy, when he was president of the French Republic, who, from a Catholic point of view, want to sort of dial back secularism a little bit. But by and large, Christians in France, which until recently, well, still actually, is most of the religious people in France, come to a sort of accommodation with secularism. You know, the 1905 law on the separation of church and state in France, together with the 1789 Declaration on the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which also contains a guarantee of religious freedom, they're both written into the current constitution of France. And in the course of the 20th century, most people come to terms with that. There's a bit of a disagreement in the 20th century about public schools, state schools, and Catholicism and so on and so forth. But largely there's a settled acceptance of laïcité, of secularism, as a core French value and a core feature of the French state. Now, recently, that's been challenged by the presence in France of large and growing numbers of Muslims in particular. And Muslim citizens of France don't feel the same way, all of them. And some of them, of course, do. Some of them are ardent secularists, but enough of them are not ardent secularists for it to have upset the truce between religious people and the French state, if you want to put it that way. So one of the reasons I think why French secularism has come to have, especially in the English-speaking world, a low reputation, as you implied it did in your question, is the contrast with American secularism, which is more about freedom. The second reason why French secularism has come to have a bad reputation is, of course, the clashes that have occurred between some French Muslims and secularism.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You mentioned in your book as well, one of the reasons behind a push for secularism is modernisation. In a way, people think it's a progression. And,
yeah, especially in the 20th century, people thought that, yeah. And
I wonder maybe as well, is it not possible that Muslims looking from outside in on this might have some sort of, special hindsight, given they've seen what secularism has done to perhaps, I suppose, weaken's not an unfair word to use in terms of Christianity, to be slowly chipped away by secular concept to the point where it's fairly benign in comparison to how it was hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Is there not a fear maybe that they have the same thing may become true of Islam if they embrace secularism?
Yes, I think that's definitely one of the reasons. I mean, there are lots of reasons why Muslims in different countries, France or elsewhere, I mean, it's most obvious in the Arab world, there are lots of reasons why Muslims oppose secularism. And again, some Muslims, because of course some Muslims are very, very keen on secularism, as many Christians are. But one of the reasons why some Muslims oppose secularism is precisely what you've identified. If you look at the history of Europe, secularism and its development goes hand in hand with the de-Christianization of social life, law, morals, and every other part of European society. So the process of secularization of society and morals and all the rest of our customs, which has taken place over the last couple of 100 years, by which process all those things that we do have become less about religion and more non-religious. That process of social secularization has gone hand in hand with the rise of political secularism and the stripping away of the same religious norms from our constitution and our laws and so on and so forth. Now that may or may not be a historical accident. People will differ on that. But certainly looking in on that development, as it were, from the outside, which, as you imply, many believing Muslims will feel they're on the outside of that process. Looking in on that process from the outside, yeah, you could easily think, well, if we accept secularism, then secularization won't be far behind. And our beliefs and the norms that we want our children and grandchildren to follow will be diluted and secularized in the same way that Christians of 150 or 200 years ago's descendants have been secularized. So that's definitely one of the reasons why some Muslims oppose secularism. I think the second reason is that many Muslims just do believe that Islam is the answer, not just to private behavior, but to public behavior. One of the biggest most traditional arguments against secularism, of course, is theocracy. This idea, especially common amongst the monotheists, that their religion just does provide the ideal blueprint for everything. And so there can't be any separation of, religion from politics, because religion is everything. God has prescribed everything for us, and all we need to do is follow the rules that he's prescribed. Now, of course, when actual states try to do that, it ends in, either pragmatic compromises or complete collapse. So, we know that theocracy is not actually a viable alternative, pure theocracy anyway, to secularism. But, many Muslims, just like some Christians and many Christians in the past, and many Jews in the past as well, just do believe that secularism is wrong because religion should provide the rules for everything. So that's two reasons. I think the third reason why some Muslims oppose secularism is that, especially in the Arab world, the regimes that they have come to know as secular have been extremely dictatorial. So if you think about, or they've been perceived as dictatorial, certainly. So they've definitely not been democratic. So if you think about the Assad regime in Syria, or Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, or secularist governments in the past in Turkey, they've all had anti-democratic elements to them, and they've all been seen as secular, and they've all been supported at different times, of course, by Western interests for geopolitical reasons, adding a sort of taint of foreignness to secularism, as well as a taint of authoritarianism and anti-democratic practice. So there's lots of reasons actually why many Muslims today might be wary of secularism or opposed to it. Firstly, they fear it will lead to secularization. Secondly, they believe that religion provides the answer in politics anyway. And thirdly, they associate it with a suppression of their own civil rights, especially in Arab countries. And I think that Western governments, especially those which come from secularist traditions, have not done very well in persuading Muslim majority societies around the world that secularism is the right answer. And in fact, they've done very badly.
We should send them your book, I think.
Yes, that's right, of course. Yes, I agree.
In the section that you give time to for opposing arguments to secularism, there's one that I found very interesting. And it's this I think in terms of secularism, I think we could both agree that secularism, rule of thumb is we wouldn't want it to privilege any one religion. I think that'd be considered secularist. But however, there's this objection that it's often seen as a Western concept, and as a result, many principles in secularism can almost be said to be Christian values in a sense. So they're saying that already we're privileging one religion in our concept of secularism because it's arising in a sort of Christian context.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you have any sort of strong refutation for that school of thought.
Or it's not just a Christian, not just seen as privileging Christianity in its norms, but more specifically Protestantism, in fact.
Right.
Especially in the United States. But this is true at least in the argument against secularism in the West. The argument against secularism in India is often a little bit different. People talk about it, privileging Hindus, privileging Hindu norms, or privileging Muslims, depending on which side of the argument you're on in India. This is a criticism of secularism, which I think is probably the strongest. I mean, you've picked this one as the from that chapter of the case against secularism. This is the only argument against secularism that actually gives me genuine trouble.
Yes, that's exactly why it jumped out to me, and I thought I must ask Andrew about that on the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, most of the arguments against secularism are quite easy to deal with. The theocratic arguments just don't add up. The multiculturalist arguments don't really add up. The ethnic conservative and sort of those sorts of arguments, the Edmund Burke and the Hindu nationalist arguments, they don't add up. But this argument that secularism is not neutral, is not objective, and has encoded in it all sorts of religious assumptions from the past, or atheist assumptions, which is the other part of this criticism quite often, is more difficult to deal with. And I think that is probably because it's partly true. you think about American secularism, think about US secularism, okay? So the founding fathers of the United States have in their amendments to their Constitution, the First Amendment, that Congress will pass no law that will be interfering with the free exercise of religion, right? Yeah. And one of the first cases brought in an American court in the 19th century about this free exercise of religion is by a Mormon. And this Mormon man has been prosecuted in his home state for the criminal offence of bigamy. He has taken an additional wife. He's been prosecuted for the crime of bigamy, and he's been convicted. And he says, my religion, I'm a Mormon, my religion tells me that I must take as many wives as I can afford. This is my religious belief, and I'm acting on the basis of this religious belief in taking additional wives. And by the way, my wives want to marry me. We're all Mormons. This criminal law against bigamy is an interference with my free exercise of religion. What he's saying there basically is he's challenging the secular state. The state has said they want to be blind, to religious norms and religious rules. Jefferson said the best way to deal with disagreements among religions was to ignore them. If you're the government, you want to just ignore religious controversies, have nothing to do with them whatsoever. There's a religious controversy here, which is about whether, how many wives people should have. And this guy brings his case saying, the secular state, he didn't use that word, of course, it wasn't in vogue at the time, secularism, but today he would say the secular state is not neutral. It has taken a position on marriage, and that position is the Protestant, Catholic, Catholic or Protestant one. It's the Christian position. Not every religion says that marriage is one man and one woman. Some religions say that it's one man and lots of women. Some religions say, very few in the world today, but some religions certainly still do say, our cultural practices at least do say, it might be one woman and lots of men. So it's Christian to say, this Mormon claims, it's Judeo-Christian, old Christian, to say that marriage is between a man and a woman. And I think he's right.
Yes.
And it's very hard to see how he isn't right in his basic claim. And the Supreme Court of the United States, I suspect, thought that he was right as well. But they didn't uphold his claim. They said, no. Free exercise of religion can't possibly mean that you can just be exempt from the criminal law, because if everyone did it, then, society would fall apart. Well, that might be a good political argument, but it's a bad legal one if you're a secular state. So they fudged the issue. And in fact, a lot of case law on free exercise in the United States, as it plays itself out in the sort of 200 years following, basically the pendulum swings from sort of saying you can have exemption from general laws, you can't have exemption from general laws, and so on and so forth. That's the way it plays out there. But if we just come back to this specific example, now, do you think that is an example of the secular state being neutral, or do you think that is an example of the secular state enforcing a very particular religious norm?
The latter, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So what's the way out of it? Well, I think that the way out of it is to simply admit that secularism, as codified in many Western countries, does have Christian assumptions in it, and also some humanistic assumptions of the Enlightenment as well. That secularism, as constituted in India, does have, some Hindu assumptions written into it, and work from there. And what would we do if we then admitted that? Well, then we would say, okay, let's try our best to maximize freedom of religion and belief from now on.
So you're advocating for multiple wives. We heard it here first.
I was about to say. Now, secularism, of course, is not just state neutrality. And political secularism in its political sense, as I say in the book, does have, in fact, lots of different definitions that are slightly different from each other. Different academics use different definitions, different campaigners use different definitions, and so on and so forth. I use a definition that's sort of like a synthesis of the various definitions that are out there, but mostly probably most closely associated with Babro, the French scholar of secularism. And I say that secularism has three parts. Firstly, the separation of state institutions from religious institutions so that they're not dominated by each other. Secondly, the maximizing or attempt to maximize the freedom of religion of belief, freedom of religion or belief of every person, up to the limits of the freedom of others. So, in a good sort of classic liberal way, my freedom to swing my fist stops at the end of your nose. So we want freedom of religion and belief for everyone, up to the point where it starts interfering with other people's freedoms, and then you can legitimately curtail them. So that's the second aspect of secularism, as I see it. And the third is the equal treatment of people within a state, regardless of religion or non-religious worldview. And I think if you take that fuller idea of secularism, then it provides you with some additional tools in your toolkit to unlock the sort of specific problems like polygamy, for example. But still, I don't think that polygamy would be stopped on secularist grounds. It may be stopped on gender equality grounds or human rights grounds or other grounds like that, but not, I think, specifically on secularist ones.
It is an interesting one. I think it's. I think there's a whole podcast on that issue could be carried out right there, I think.
Yes, got to think. Right, I think it's a fair criticism as we've just discussed it, right? But actually, I think most of the critics in the real world who make this criticism of secularism are not being fair. They're trying to find ways of discrediting secularism because they basically don't like it. They're either they would prefer to see a more sort of multiculturalist approach, and that's their starting point.
Yeah, and of course, this example, this case study is a very rare outlier example in a sense, isn't it?
Exactly.
Okay, well, I wanted to touch a little bit on about countries' constitutions, what they have in codified versus their practices. I mean, you talk a lot about Turkey in your book and the principles of Ataturk and how current leaders still pay lip service to them. However, I think you may have described Erdogan as his government as Islamist, or certainly
they definitely want to be. I mean, they're Islamizing. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, so it's very socially conservative, Islamically in an Islamic sense, and that's sort of the inverse of Britain, the UK. In a way, we're a Christian country in name. However, attitudes are relatively secular. We have bishops in the House of Lords, and the Queen's the head of the church. And there's a bit of discussion in your book about whether or not that's significant enough to go for it in service of a secularist cause. If societally wise, everything seems hunky dory, is it really a priority of secularists to be concerned about these things that just seem to be traditions more than anything? I'm
interested that you read it that way. Actually, that's an interesting way of putting it. I mean, in the book, when I look at the Church of England as a sort of case study of established churches, it's in the context of some people, especially from the Church of England, arguing that established churches, states with established churches, are a better way of achieving, equality and freedom than a secular state is.
Right.
Which I suppose is just another way of putting what you've just said. Although what you said is very interesting. I'll have to think about it a bit more in the future. I mean, the UK, or rather England and the Westminster sort of state, let's put it that way, are an interesting case study. We're probably the most non-religious society with the most religious constitution. The disparity between the two is probably the widest in the world, because the UK state is very churchy. I mean, as you say, the head of state, has to be of a particular religion. We have representatives of the state church in our legislature. We're the only Christian state to go that far. And as you say, we are a Christian state. And Parliament opens with prayers in Westminster, not in the devolved areas. The church is a very prominent, and in some policy areas, some areas of government policy, very powerful force. And yet, only under 5% of the population are in its churches on any given Sunday, and only about 15% of the population even believe that in Jesus and that he was the Son of God. Never mind the nuances of Anglican doctrine. So the mismatch between the nature of our society and the nature of our state in the UK, I think, is probably the largest in the world. Now, is it worth getting bothered about? Yes, I think it is.
Yeah.
I think there are lots of reasons for that. I don't think that a state that has a religious character or privileges a particular religious denomination can ever really make its citizens feel that they are equal citizens. I think equal citizenship is vital to a modern democracy. We all need to feel an equal stake in this country, and for it to be seen as a Christian country or a Christian state, I think dissolves that. I mean, I think I was once on a panel with a representative of the Church of England, not a bishop, but I don't know, one of the ones below that. Let's call him a canon. I think that's a nice word. It has a martial air. It was a canon, and he said, something that I discussed in the book. Actually, he said that the Church of England was an establishment, but it was a hospitable establishment. We wanted everyone to feel, every non-Christian to feel like a welcome guest. That was, and the church as a hospitable establishment could make people feel more welcome than a secular state could. And that claim completely outraged me. Here I am, a citizen of this country, the country in which I was born, where I live, where I pay my taxes, where I feel I belong, where I help my neighbours, where I do my civic duty, where my parents were born, where my grandparents were born, where my great-grandparents were born, where my great-great-grandparents were born, who also did all of those things, and a large number of those ancestors of mine not Christians either. And then to be told that, as a non-Christian, you're a valued guest in a hospitable Christian state. No, absolutely not. I mean, even the most welcome guest is not at home. And I think that what we want is for every citizen to feel at home in their country, in the country to which they have citizenship and nationality. So I think that there is a symbolic importance to the state not partaking of any one particular religious or non-religious identity, and I think that's vital. So I think it does matter. Church establishment does matter, but it matters in all sorts of practical implications. I mean, and it matters for the church as much as for the state. I mean, why should the Church of England have to have state agreement before it can have women bishops? Why can't they just have women bishops if they want them, and not have them, if they don't? And why should the government choose bishops? It's ridiculous. And equally, why should I or any other non-Christian have our child excluded from local school, which our taxes pay for, because it's a church school run by the Church of England that can select its pupils on religious grounds? So establishment can seem like a very abstract issue on one level, but on another level, especially in England, it can bite down on people quite significantly. Yeah. So I think it's always worth challenging. Turkey, as you say, is a very interesting example of a state where it's completely the other way. Quite a religious society, not all of it by any means. There are a large number of non-religious people in Turkey, are getting smaller all the time, I'm afraid, but through persecution, but nonetheless still significant. But there, the state, of course, was secularized, as it were, without a democratic mandate. So Ataturk, as you mentioned, wanted to see a secular republic in Turkey, and it was certainly a secular republic throughout his lifetime. He was president for life, of course, in the good tradition of statesmen in that part of the world. But once he died, and once there were democratic elections, secularism began to be eroded, really from that time onwards. And it does seem that Turkey can have democracy or it can have secularism, but it can't have both. And one of the reasons there, I think, is that the secularization that was enforced on the state did not go hand in hand, as it did in Europe, with a secularization of society over decades, but was very immediate and top-down and inorganic, and there was that mismatch the other way from the way it is in the UK, between a secular state and a quite religious population. And I don't think that Turkey really is a secular state now. It's still there in the constitution. It says it's secular, although there have been noises from Erdogan's government saying that when they rewrite the constitution, they might not necessarily say it is secular. I think they probably will continue to pay lip service to the secular tradition of Ataturk, but at least it's been out there on the table that they might not. But I don't think that the Turkish state really ever has been secular in the sense that we spoke about a moment ago, of having freedom of religion and belief, of separating the state from the church and the church from the state, or the mosque in this case, of having equal treatment. What really was the case in Turkey was not that there was secularism, but that there was state control of religion. I mean, there's a massive government department there to regulate mosques and religion and the very particular denomination of Islam that most Turks who are religious are members of, writing the sermons, licensing the imams, and so on and so forth. So I don't think that the Turkish state ever really was secular in the proper sense of the word.
Yeah, that's a very thoughtful answer, actually, to my question about Great Britain and its relationship with the Christian Church, or England specifically. I think, as well, a lot of people make the mistake, and I do this as well, being a hopeless optimist, that secularism will progress and it's just a matter of time, really. It's sort of a modern snowball effect. And in your chapter, Secularism in Practice, you sort of cite some research by Jonathan Fox, and he's analysed the approaches to religion and state for 177 countries, I think it says. So this is looking at laws and regulations and practices.
Yes.
And you sort of summarise that data, and I'll just read what you say. If there is such a thing as a global tendency in religious state relations today, it is in the opposite direction from the secular, which is very surprising to me, and that's quite a huge concern, really, is it, that it seems to be going the other way?
Yes, I mean, Fox's data there are problems with it. I think that his approach, you can question whether or not the examples he gives of a secular versus a non-secular practice are completely correct. But it is the only big and data-driven analysis of so many states, secularism or non-secularism. And there is no doubt that there are more states that have moved away from secularism in the last decade or so than have moved towards it. And the states that have moved towards it are very small. So Fiji, Nepal, which is nothing to say in denigration of those countries, but they are not the big global players.
No.
And it's far more likely, if you want to put it this way, it's far more, if a state is changing its approach today, it is far more likely that it is going to be changing it in a non-secular direction than in a secular one. Now, you can say, well, even when the opposite was true, even in the great days of secularizing constitutions in the mid to late 20th century, how serious actually were the states that did this? Because China has a secular constitution. They include in their constitution the words that lots of states include from the middle of the 20th century about freedom of religion and belief and freedom to practice and freedom to manifest and so on. Well, we all know that's not actually the situation in China, and that even though it's written there in their constitution or constitutive documents of their state, it's not there in practice. So I think that the desecularization of states that seems to be occurring at the moment may be more of a black letter of the law issue than a practical issue. We may just be sort of recognizing what was already the case, which is that many states that claim secularism in principle didn't actually practice it. And that can't be a complete explanation of Jonathan Fox's data in particular, because he doesn't just look at laws. He doesn't just look at constitutions. He does look at practices and policies, social policies as well as everything else. And still the direction, the tendency is in the non-secular direction. Well, why is it happening? I think that there are regions, certainly, in which secularism has been discredited. It might make more sense actually to ask why did it happen the other way in the first place in the 20th century? And I think that's the answer to that question might illuminate some of the problems we're having today. So secularism's advance in the 20th century, where it could look, as if it was just inevitable, like liberal democracy and welfare economics, that these things were going to dominate the political economy of the world for forever. One of the reasons was that the big countries that were leading global public opinion and leading the global economy, countries like the United States, countries like the Soviet Union, which claimed secularism even though it wasn't a secular state really, and the sort of countries that were well represented in the United Nations, like France, these were secular states in their constitutions. Countries like Britain were seen as being secular in their political ethos, even if they weren't, secular in their constitutions. And so it was just seen as a successful model. One of the reasons why Nehru, one of the founders of the modern state of India, saw secularism as essential for India was that he saw it, as he said it, as one of the pillars of modernity. This was just what you needed to be if you wanted to partake in the modern world. And the successful states of the 20th century were seen as being in part successful because of their secular nature. So that is not the case today. I don't think there is the same global admiration, and there certainly isn't the same global economic power from those states today. We all know that we're moving into a world that has a large number of countries capable of exerting global power, and that they're not all democratic. Some of them are very very anti-democratic, and they're not all secular, and some of them are very anti-secular. Most of the oil wealth in the world, for example, is to be found in non-secular regimes. And so I think that shift of power from states that either were or could be seen as secular to states that are very much not, does sort of shift the aspirations of governments in the world, and also of grassroots protest movements. I mean, it's a lot of people in the Arab world in particular who once might have seen a sort of secular modernity on Western lines as being the big alternative to the current regimes that they live under. A lot of people, there are still people who think that, of course, and maybe large numbers, but there are also growing numbers of people who see an Islamic state as the most viable alternative to the governments that they currently labour under. And that's just one part of the problem today. But it is definitely one of the explanations for why states where they have the choice are desecularizing rather than secularizing.
Okay, well, I really enjoyed the book. I'm definitely going to read through it again as well, because I took a lot away from it, and it's to somebody who feels like they're already engaged in this argument of secularism and humanism. I still learned a lot, and it sort of changed my thinking a bit, which is always good. So congratulations on the reception it's getting. I did notice that you tweeted out that Richard Dawkins and Rowan Williams had been united in their praise for the book.
I thought that was quite nice, didn't you?
Yeah.
I was glad with Rowan Williams' comment because, as I said, it tries to be an objective, sort of fair-minded text, and they were almost exactly the words he used to describe it. So I was pleased with that. But certainly I was even more pleased that both Rowan Williams and Richard Dawkins had said that it was a good thing, because if you can please both those audiences, I think then it must be quite an objective book. Different from one of the humanist philosophers that I was talking to about it, who read it for me before it was published. Who said I was far too kind on the arguments against secularism. He thought that I'd made too strong a case for the arguments against secularism. Actually, that's almost all we've talked about here as well. There are a lot of arguments for secularism in the book.
I think the thing is, with the bulk of my podcast usually deals with making those arguments and pushing back. So it's nice to. I think having conversations like this will only strengthen your arguments for secularism if you disband, with your false assumptions and things like that. So yeah. I'm very grateful for the work you put in, and I appreciate for somebody in your position, it must be a very difficult thing to do.
Yes, it is. I mean, I think that's right. I still think, of course, that secularism is the only plausible way to order modern states. But I think one of the things that's possibly changed as I work my way through writing this and thinking about it more is the reasons why I think that. I mean, I think that probably I would have been more on the sort of Ataturk, Nehru, French revolutionary side of the reasons why we need secularism. The idea that for democracy and modernity and freedom and all those other reasons. And now I think I'm more on the sort of Jefferson, Gandhi. Yeah. We need this because we live in a diverse world and it's always going to be diverse.
Yeah, I'm very jealous of the American Constitution, specifically the First Amendment. I could do without the Second, to be honest,
yes.
But a big fan of the First Amendment.
The Second Amendment is difficult, isn't it?
Very much.
Thankfully not for us. I think that this is well outside the scope of my book, but I was talking to a friend about this yesterday, and we both agreed that the way for them to resolve the Second Amendment issue was that everyone has the right to bear arms, but they can only bear the arms that were available in the 1780s. And that the living constitution of the United States has to just be frozen
muskets.
Just for that, for their muskets. That's right. That would probably be a good answer for them.
Have I got time to pick your brains on the new Star Trek then, given you're a huge Trekkie? I was looking forward to asking someone like you what you make of it all.
Well, where are we now? Episode 4, is it?
I didn't finish 3, to be honest. I need to give it another go.
You do need to give it another go. I mean, I am such a Star Trek fan that anything with the word Star Trek on it will guarantees my attention. I would never... I hear people who claim to be devout trekkers who say, "Oh yeah, I never finished Deep Space Nine," and I think, "What are you talking about? How can you possibly not have done this?" So of course, I'm automatically a fan. I think one of the things that this series has done very well is to maintain, against all odds, the very humanist vision of Star Trek. Gene Roddenberry, who invented Star Trek, of course, as you know, was an ardent humanist, and many of the key writers and actors in all the series of Star Trek have been so as well. But it started in that sort of optimistic, very humanistic time in the mid-20th century, a bit like we were discussing earlier. And, of course, times look very different now. But I think that even in today's context, one of the things that Star Trek has done very well has maintained that optimism and that rationality and that humanist vision. And I think that this series has that as well. I'm not finding it quite, this seems a strange thing to say about science fiction, but I'm not finding it quite as plausible as I found other series. This technology that allows starships to move through the universe, making use of fungal spores, these are spoilers, by the way, I should have said spoilers.
Spoiler, I'll put that up front, don't worry.
And and I think, well, if that's the case, then they better resolve this plot line pretty quickly, because otherwise, why is everyone using warp drives in the 300 years that follow it?
Yeah, there's a big debate surrounding canon at the minute, isn't there? Whether it's linear or not in terms of the narrative. So it'll be interesting to see how that's resolved. But I will definitely give it another look.
I think you should. I think the characterization is shaping up quite well.
Oh, good.
And that's one of the most important things, of course, about Star Trek is the characters.
Excellent. Well, Andrew, it's always a pleasure catching up and speaking to you. I always feel more informed afterwards, which is a good thing. I'll make sure at the start of the episode to point people in the direction of how they can support Humanist and get your book, but maybe you could just remind people now how they could get a bit more involved in that sense.
Absolutely. Well, join Humanists UK, the website for which is humanists.uk, which is very easy to remember, humanists.uk. And the book, Secularism, published by Oxford University Press, is available from all good bookshops and, of course, Amazon.
And some terrible bookshops as well, I would imagine. Yes,
I hope it's available from all bookshops, the good and the bad.
Andrew, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for speaking to me again.
Thank you very much. I love your podcast.
Thank you very much to my excellent guest, and thank you all for listening. And I'm going to say a special thank you to a number of Patreon supporters. You'll have to forgive me for butchering your name. If I do, let me know. First of all, Morgan Gilroy, thank you Morgan. Alex Torres, thanks Alex. Dan Pollitt, thank you. Nikolai Reuschling, I'm sorry Nikolai, let me know. Alistair Lichton, sorry Alistair. Alistair's such a nice guy and I've probably just slaughtered his surname. Ben Carlisle, Jeremy Rhodes, Ulrich Nye, Fran Sarrell, Johan Olsen, Ben Hubbard, Mike Wagg, Jan Sushanek, Gary Gallagher, Andrew Graham, Simon Horrocks, Deborah Solkind, Clay Hardwick, Frankie Taggart, Tom Palmer, Scott Ashcraft, Hans Eriksson, Tero Narinen, Kay Abednego, Chris Baker, Jan Enevelson, Graham Strong, and Ken Ellsworth. You guys really help with all your support. You enable me to maintain the podcast, buy new equipment, and travel to events to bring more content back, and it is greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. If you'd like to become a Patreon, you can do by visiting patreon.com/gspellchecker. Think we've all learned something here today?